The hiss of the steam engine was a sigh of surrender as the train slowed, its iron wheels groaning against the track. Outside the grimy window, the world had bleached to shades of brown and pale, washed out blue, dust, fine as flour, coated everything, dancing in the harsh afternoon light and settling on the raw timber of the station platform. For 3 days, Eleanor had watched the green hills and orderly farms of the east fall away, replaced by a landscape that seemed to have been scraped clean by the hand of a hard god. Now, arriving in Promise, Nevada, felt less like reaching a destination and more like coming to the end of the world. She stood when the train shuddered to a final stop, her movements stiff, deliberate. Her dress was gray, the fabric sturdy and without adornment, the high collar a fortress around her neck. She had pulled her dark hair back so tightly that it tugged at her temples, a constant, dull ache that she welcomed. Pain was a familiar anchor. She adjusted the small, worn hat on her head, her gloved fingers precise, and took up her single valise. It was light. She had not brought much with her. The past was a weight she carried in her bones, not in her luggage. Stepping down onto the platform was like stepping into an oven. The heat was a physical presence, pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with the smell of dust, dry wood, and horse. Men in sweat-stained hats paused their work to watch her, their gazes lingering, heavy with a lazy curiosity that made the skin on her neck prickle. She ignored them, her face a mask of indifference, her eyes a cool, clear gray, swept over the scene without truly seeing it, a defense she had perfected long ago. You could not be hurt by a world you refused to let in. A man detached himself from the shade of the station master's office and walked toward her. He was tall, taller than most, with the kind of frame that was built of lean muscle and hard work, not bulk. His shoulders were broad under a simple cotton shirt. The sleeves rolled to his forearms. The sun had weathered his skin and bleached the ends of his brown hair. He moved with an unhurried quietness that seemed to absorb the town's rough noise rather than add to it. He stopped a few feet from her, removing his hat. It was a gesture of simple courtesy, nothing more. Mrs. Vance?" he asked. His voice was low and steady, a calm sound in the day's oppressive heat. "I am," she replied, her own voice sounding brittle and unused in the open air. "Caleb Armstrong." He offered the name as a simple fact. There was no practiced charm in his expression, no flirtatious glint in his hazel eyes. He looked at her directly, a straightforward gaze that was unsettling in its lack of pretense. He was not trying to appraise her, or charm her, or intimidate her. He was simply looking at the woman he had agreed to marry. He reached for her valise. "Allow me." His fingers brushed hers as he took the handle, and she drew her hand back as if burned. It was a small, sharp movement, almost imperceptible, but he noticed. He said nothing, his expression unchanging, but he did not try to touch her again. As he led her toward a wagon hitched near the water trough, the whispers followed them, rustling like dry leaves. "That's her," a woman's voice murmured from the doorway of the general store. "The one Armstrong sent for looks a bit frozen," a man's voice answered. "Heard she comes from back east, fleeing something. I'd wager a woman with a face like that has seen trouble." The words were barbs, meant to sting, but Eleanor gave no sign she had heard them. She kept her chin high, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on the back of Caleb's shirt. Let them talk. Their gossip could not touch the cold, quiet place inside her where she lived. Caleb loaded her valise into the back of the wagon and then turned to help her up. He offered a hand, but seeing the stiffness in her posture, he simply gestured to the step. She climbed aboard without assistance, her skirts whispering against the dry wood, and settled on the hard bench. He walked around to the other side and took up the reins, the leather creaking in his grip, with a soft click of his tongue. He set the two sturdy horses into motion. The town of Promise fell away behind them. A handful of wooden buildings huddled together against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the high desert. The wagon wheels churned up clouds of pale dust that followed them like a ghost. The silence between them stretched, punctuated only by the clop of hooves and the rattle of the wagon. Caleb did not seem to feel the need to fill it. He drove with a relaxed competence, his eyes on the horizon. Eleanor stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. She had answered his advertisement in a Godey's Ladies book, a small, discreet notice that had spoken of a need for a wife and partner, not a lover. Widower, 34 years of age, owner of a modest cattle ranch, seeks a woman of good character for the purpose of marriage, honesty and a capacity for hard work valued above all else. His letters had been as spare and direct as his advertisement. He had told her of his land, the small house his father had built, the challenges of the seasons. He had not written of loneliness or affection. His words were practical, grounded, safe. It was why she had chosen him. She was not looking for a husband. She was looking for a hiding place. The ride was long. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and red. The heat finally began to break, and a cool breeze stirred, carrying the scent of sagebrush. The landscape was beautiful in its own stark, lonely way. But Eleanor felt nothing. Beauty was a luxury, like warmth or trust. She could not afford it. Just as true dark was settling, Caleb turned the wagon off the main track and onto a smaller, less worn path. A few minutes later, a light appeared in the distance, a single golden square shining in the immense blackness. It was the window of a house. The ranch was not large, but it was well kept. The fences were mended, the yard was free of clutter, and the barn, though weathered, stood straight and strong. The house itself was a simple timber structure, with a porch running the length of the front. It was, as he had written, modest. But as she drew closer, she saw that it was also clean. The windows were washed, the porch was swept, and a pot of hardy geraniums sat by the door, a small, stubborn splash of color. Caleb brought the wagon to a halt and set the brake. "We're here," he said quietly. He got down and came around to her side. But again, he made no move to help her unless she asked for it. She climbed down on her own, her legs stiff from the long ride. He took her valise and led her up the porch steps. Pushing the door open, the inside of the house was one large room, which served as a kitchen, dining area, and living space. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, radiating a gentle warmth. A sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A worn armchair was pulled up near the stone fireplace, a stack of books on a small crate beside it. The room was sparse, masculine, but like the outside, it was impeccably clean. The floorboards were scrubbed, the pots hanging by the stove were polished, and there was no dust to be seen. "It's not much," Caleb said, placing her bag by the door, "but it's solid." "It is fine," Eleanor replied, her voice as neat and contained as the room itself. He gestured to one of the 2 doors leading off the main room. "This will be your room. It was my parents'." He then pointed to the other, smaller door. "That one's mine." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. The room he had given her was clearly the larger, better of the 2. He seemed to understand her unspoken thought. "You'll want the space," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I don't require much. There is water in the pitcher on the basin. I'll bring up some hot water for you to wash with. Supper is simple tonight. Stew." He left her then, going back outside to tend to the horses. Eleanor stepped into her new room. It held a large 4-poster bed, a heavy oak dresser, and a small washstand. A handmade quilt, its colors faded to soft blues and creams, was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. It was a room that had known a life, a history, before her. She ran a gloved finger along the smooth, cool wood of the dresser. This was to be her life now. A quiet, empty room at the edge of nowhere. It was all she had asked for. She worked for him, for the house, with a tireless, silent efficiency. In the days that followed, she fell into a routine that was as rigid and unyielding as her posture. She rose before dawn, lighting the stove and putting the coffee on to boil. She cooked his breakfast, cleaned the house, tended the small vegetable garden out back, and washed their clothes in a large tub with harsh lye soap. She did the work of a wife, but she was more like a hired housekeeper. She spoke only when necessary, answering his questions with brief, formal replies. She never met his gaze, focusing instead on a point just over his shoulder or on the worn floorboards at his feet. She was a ghost in his home, a presence defined by her quiet labor and the empty space she kept around herself. Caleb did not press her. He accepted her silence as he accepted the heat of the day and the chill of the night. He ate the meals she prepared, thanked her quietly, and went about his own demanding work on the ranch. He never raised his voice, never slammed a door, never made a sudden move in her presence. His consideration was a constant, gentle pressure against the wall she had built around herself, and she found it deeply unsettling. Kindness was a language she no longer understood. The nights were the worst. After the supper dishes were washed and the fire was banked, she would retreat to her room and he to his, but sleep did not come easily. She would stand by her window, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky, and the memories would come for her. She would wrap her arms around herself, her body beginning to tremble, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. The clean, quiet smell of Caleb's house would fade, replaced by the ghost scent of stale whiskey and anger. She was back in another room, in another life, the air thick with a rage so potent it was almost a living thing. Her late husband, Daniel, had not been a quiet man like Caleb. His moods had been storms that could break without warning. She remembered his hands, large and calloused, and how quickly they could clench into fists. She remembered the sickening thud of a fist hitting wood, the wall, her own body. He had called her cold, unresponsive, a wife of ice. He had tried to melt her with his fury, to break her down with his fists, believing her spirit was a fortress to be taken by force. Tonight, the memory was sharper. She was on the floor, the rough wood pressing into her cheek. The taste of blood was in her mouth. He was standing over her, his face dark with drink and rage. "You will learn to be a wife to me?" His voice echoed in her mind, thick and slurred. But that night, something had broken in her. Not her spirit, but her fear. As he reached for her again, she had scrambled away, her hand closing around the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She saw it in flashes, the glint of the iron in the lamplight, the shock in his eyes, the awful, wet sound it made. Her hands were slick with blood, his blood. He had fallen, a dead weight, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. A lawman had come, a tired, grim-faced man who had looked at Daniel's body, at the bruises blooming on her face, and at the terror in her eyes. He had sighed, a long, weary sound. "You're lucky he's dead," he'd said, his voice devoid of pity. "A man like that, it was bound to happen. Now get your things and disappear before his family comes looking for justice. There's nothing for you here but a grave or a hangman." Eleanor's fingers dug into her own arms, her knuckles white. She was trembling so violently now she had to grip the window frame to stay upright. The cool night air felt like a lie against her feverish skin. She had disappeared. She had become Mrs. Vance, a widow. And now she was here, a mail-order bride to a man she did not know. But the past was not gone. It lived inside her, a coiled snake waiting to strike. One afternoon, she was hanging laundry on the line when she saw Caleb in the corral with a young mare that had a nasty gash on its leg from a run-in with a barbed wire fence. Eleanor paused, her hands still holding a damp sheet, and watched from behind the billowing cotton. Caleb was not trying to rope or force the frightened animal. He stood in the center of the corral, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur. His movements were slow, predictable. He held out a bucket with oats, letting the horse come to him. It took a long time. The mare shied away again and again, its eyes wide with pain and fear. But Caleb did not lose his patience. He just stood there, speaking softly, waiting. Finally, the horse took a hesitant step forward, then another. It dipped its head and began to eat from the bucket. Only then did Caleb slowly, gently, reach out and touch its neck. He kept talking, his voice a steady, calming rhythm, as he began to clean the wound. Eleanor stood frozen, the damp sheet clutched in her hand. She had never seen a man use gentleness as a tool. With Daniel, strength had been about breaking things. With Caleb, it seemed to be about mending them. The sight confused her. It poked at the edges of her certainty, the hard-won belief that all men were a threat. She turned away abruptly, her heart pounding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm, and went back to her work. The nights grew colder as autumn settled over the high desert. A sharp wind whispered around the corners of the house, and the warmth from the fireplace became a welcome comfort. One evening, after she had finished cleaning the kitchen, Eleanor stood by the back door, looking out at the endless, star-strewn darkness. She had not realized how cold it had become, and a shiver ran through her thin dress. "You'll catch a chill." Caleb's voice came from behind her, and she flinched. Spinning around, he was standing by the hearth, holding a thick, dark blue wool shawl. It was finely woven, with a simple embroidered edge. "My mother made this," he said, his voice still quiet. He took a step toward her, holding it out. "She was always cold. You should wear it." He was offering her a piece of his past, a piece of his family. It was an act of intimacy, of connection, that felt as loud and dangerous as a gunshot. Her every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to refuse it. To take it would be to accept a kindness she did not want, a warmth she did not believe she deserved. It was a crack in the ice, and she could not afford to let anything in. Her body recoiled before her mind could even form a word. She took a sharp step back, her hand flying up as if to ward off a blow. Her breath caught in her throat, a small, choked gasp. Caleb stopped instantly. He saw the flicker of sheer terror in her eyes, the way her body braced for an impact. He looked down at the shawl in his hands, then back at her. A flicker of understanding, or perhaps just deep sorrow, passed through his own gaze. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not push. He simply lowered his hands and folded the shawl, placing it gently on the back of the armchair by the fire. "It will be here if you need it," he said, and the quietness of his voice was a balm and a torment. Then he turned and went to his room, leaving her alone in the flickering firelight. Eleanor stood there for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from the violent collision of her past with her present. He had offered her comfort, and she had reacted as if he had raised a fist. Slowly, she made her way to her own room and closed the door. She did not go to the window tonight. She stood in the center of the room, in the absolute dark, wrapping her arms around her own thin frame. The house was silent. The man in the next room was quiet, kind, and patient. And that, she realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. A fist she knew how to brace for, a gentle hand. She did not. She closed her eyes, the image of his face, etched with a quiet sadness, burning in her mind. A single hot tear escaped and tracked a path through the dust on her cheek. She angrily wiped it away. Crying was a weakness. Feeling was a vulnerability. She had survived by becoming a fortress of ice, and she would not let one kind man, one soft gesture, bring her walls tumbling down. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air cold in her lungs. In the dark, she whispered the words that had become her prayer, her promise to herself, her only creed. You can't break me if I don't feel anything. The monthly trip to town for supplies was an unavoidable necessity, a journey Eleanor had been dreading for a week. The wagon ride was a silent one. The vast, empty landscape a mirror of the distance between them on the hard wooden bench. When they pulled up in front of the general store, the heart of Promise's social world, Eleanor felt a familiar coldness seep into her bones, an armor against the stares and whispers she knew were waiting. Inside, the store was a jumble of smells: roasted coffee beans, new leather, cured tobacco, and the dry, dusty scent of flour and grain. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife and the town's primary purveyor of gossip, gave Eleanor a look that was both sharp and sweet, like a candied crabapple. "Hey, Mrs. Armstrong," she said, her voice dripping with insincere warmth. "Good to see you out and about. We were all beginning to wonder if your husband was keeping you locked away." She laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. Several other women who had been examining a bolt of calico turned to listen, their expressions hungry. Eleanor merely inclined her head, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of a response. She handed her list to Mr. Gable, a small, harried man who lived in his wife's shadow. As Caleb was busy discussing the price of barbed wire with another rancher, Mrs. Gable leaned conspiratorially over the counter toward Eleanor. "A man like Caleb needs companionship," she said, her voice dropping to a loud whisper. "A strong man like that. It's a wife's duty to provide comfort. He seems a bit weary. A cold bed does a man no good." The implication was as coarse as burlap and just as scratching. It was an accusation. Eleanor was failing in her wifely duties, denying her husband his physical rights. Her hands, resting on the worn wood of the counter, clenched into fists. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a flush of shame and fury. The other women were watching, their eyes glinting. They were judging her, condemning her, and she had no words to defend herself without revealing a truth far more damning than their petty assumptions. Before she could force a single, frozen word from her throat, Caleb was there. He had moved so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. He placed a large, steady hand on the counter beside hers. Though he did not touch her, he looked directly at Mrs. Gable, his hazel eyes calm but as hard as river stones. "My wife's character is my business. Martha," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent store, "and I find it to be of the highest quality. The state of my bed is of no concern to anyone but myself. Now, if you'll have Jed finish filling our order, we'll be on our way." There was no anger in his voice, no shouting, but the authority in it was absolute. "Mrs." Gable's smirk faltered, and a blotchy red color crept up her neck. She sputtered for a moment, then turned away without another word, busying herself with a stack of tin cans. The other women suddenly found the bolt of calico intensely fascinating once more. The moment was over. He had defended her, not with a show of force, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity that had shamed them all into silence. The wagon ride home was even quieter than the ride in, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was thick with unspoken things. The shame in Eleanor's stomach had curdled into a hard knot of resentment. He had defended her, yes, but in doing so, he had claimed her. "My wife." The words echoed in her mind. When the town was a mere smudge of dust behind them, she finally spoke, her voice tight and clipped. "Why did you do that?" Caleb kept his eyes on the horses. "Do what?" "In the store. Defend me." "They were speaking ill of my wife," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I am your wife in name only," she snapped, the words sharper than she intended. "A piece of paper. You did not have to say anything." He was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady plod of the horses. "I gave you my name, Eleanor. I expect people to treat it, and the person who wears it, with respect." Something in his calm, rational tone infuriated her. It made her feel small, like a child. "Why did you send for me, Caleb?" she asked, the question erupting from a place of wounded pride she hadn't known she still possessed. "You are not a man who seems desperate for company. You are respected. You could have had your pick of any woman in that town, any woman who would serve your needs." She spat the last words out, tasting the bitterness of Mrs. Gable's insinuation. He finally turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Is that what you think this is about? Loneliness? Needs?" He shook his head, a small, weary gesture. "After my parents passed, and my brother, after Jacob was gone, the women in town decided I was their project. Every church social, every barn raising, there was another niece or a cousin or a widowed sister being pushed at me. They saw an unmarried man with a decent piece of land, and they saw an opportunity." He looked back at the horizon. "I grew tired of it, tired of the gossip, the speculation, tired of their pity. I needed a wife to put an end to it. I needed a partner who understood work. I figured an arrangement, honest and upfront, was better than a courtship built on false pretenses. I did not hire you out of loneliness, Eleanor. I hired you for the peace your presence would bring." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was worse than she had imagined. She was not a companion, not even an object of desire. She was a shield, a barricade he had erected against small-town matchmaking. The sting to her pride was sharp and deep. All this time she had been terrified of his expectations, when in fact he had almost none at all. It was a humiliating and strangely liberating realization. If he wanted nothing from her, then she had nothing to fear, but it also meant she was nothing to him. A tool, a convenience, a woman with cold eyes who was useful for keeping other women away. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The knowledge that he did not see her as a solution to some deep, personal ache allowed a fraction of her guard to lower. One morning, as she poured his coffee, she found herself pouring a cup for herself and sitting down at the table with him, instead of standing by the stove as she usually did. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but said nothing. They drank their coffee in silence, but it was a shared silence, a small island of domestic truce in the quiet house. She started asking questions, simple and impersonal at first. "Will we have enough hay for the winter? Did your father build this fireplace?" He answered her in his direct, uncomplicated way. And sometimes his answers would lead to small stories about his family, about the brother he had mentioned. Jacob had been younger, wilder, the one with the quick laugh and the reckless spirit. She listened, her hands wrapped around her warm mug, and for the first time she began to see Caleb not as a man or a husband, but as a person with his own ghosts. She noticed the small things, too, the way he never raised his voice, not even to a stubborn mule, the way he mended a broken chair leg with a patient, focused skill. He was a man of immense physical strength. She could see that in the muscles of his back and arms as he worked, but he wielded that strength with a quiet, deliberate control. He was never careless with it. That control was tested when the storm hit. It came on suddenly, a dark bruise on the northwestern horizon that spread across the sky with unnatural speed. The air grew heavy and still, the light turning a sickly yellow. Caleb came in from the fields at a run. "A big one's coming," he said, his voice urgent but calm. "We need to secure the barn." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She pulled on a heavy coat and followed him out into the wind, which was now whipping her skirts around her legs and tearing at her hair, pulling strands loose from their severe bun. The sky was the color of slate, and the first fat drops of rain were beginning to fall. The wind hit the large barn doors with a furious roar, threatening to tear them from their hinges. "I'll hold them," Caleb shouted over the gale. "There's rope by the tack room. We need to lash the crossbeam." He put his shoulder to the massive wooden doors, his body a bulwark against the storm's fury. The muscles in his back and legs strained with the effort. Eleanor ran. her boots slipping in the mud, and found the thick coil of rope. The wind fought her every step of the way back, a malevolent, unseen force. Together, they worked. He held the door steady while she looped the rope around the heavy interior beam, her fingers numb with cold. A sudden, violent gust ripped a loose shutter from a high window, sending it crashing down. Eleanor cried out and stumbled back, throwing an arm up to protect her face. The edge of the shutter scraped along her forearm, a sharp, stinging pain. Caleb saw her fall. For a second, he looked ready to abandon the door, but he held his ground, his jaw tight. "Are you all right?" he yelled. "I'm fine," she shouted back, though her arm was throbbing and she could feel a warm wetness through her sleeve. She scrambled to her feet and finished tying the knot, pulling it tight with all her strength. Once it was secure, Caleb helped her check the livestock and bolt the remaining windows. By the time they fought their way back to the house, they were both soaked to the bone and shivering, the full might of the storm raging around them. Inside, the warm, fire-lit kitchen felt like a sanctuary. Caleb immediately went to the stove and stirred the embers, adding fresh wood. "Get out of those wet things," he said, his back to her. "I'll get you that shawl." Eleanor went to her room, her hands shaking as she unbuttoned her sodden dress. Her arm was bleeding more than she'd thought, a long, shallow gash from wrist to elbow. When she came back out, wrapped in her dry nightgown and a robe, Caleb was waiting with a dark blue shawl. He also had a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. "Let me see your arm," he said, his voice gentle. She hesitated. The memory of his last offered kindness, and her panicked reaction to it hung in the air between them. But this was different. This was a practical matter, an injury. She sat at the table and reluctantly held out her arm. His touch was surprisingly soft as he cleaned the wound. His fingers were large and calloused from work, but his movements were careful, methodical. Every brush of the cloth against her skin made her muscles tense. It was a kindness, a tenderness, that felt alien and invasive. It was a touch without anger, without demand, and it terrified her more than any blow ever had. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the wave of panic that rose in her throat. "Don't be kind," she whispered, the words so quiet he had to lean in to hear them. "It hurts more." He paused, the cloth still resting on her arm. He looked at her, at the rigid line of her jaw and the tremor in her hands, and a deep, sad understanding dawned in his eyes. He said nothing. He simply finished cleaning the gash, applied a salve that smelled of pine, and wrapped her arm in a clean bandage. His touch was clinical now, efficient, the brief moment of tenderness gone. That night, as the rain hammered on the roof and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, Eleanor lay in her bed and could not sleep. The strange, painful feeling of Caleb's gentle hands on her skin had unlocked a memory she kept buried deeper than all the others. She was a bride again, young and terrified, in another barn, in another life. The air had been thick with the smell of hay and sour whiskey. Daniel had been dragging her by the arm, his grip like an iron manacle. He had been angry, his face flushed, his words slurred. "You're my wife," he'd snarled, shoving her against a rough wooden stall. "You'll act like one." Her cries had been small, swallowed by the cavernous dark of the barn. Her resistance, her fear, had only enraged him more. "Stop being so cold," he had growled, his hand tangling in her hair. "I'll warm you up." Her struggles had been useless, her pleas had been ignored, her coldness had been her crime, and he had been her punishment. A dry, silent sob escaped her lips in the darkness of her room. She finally understood. It wasn't kindness itself that hurt. It was the memory of what had been done to her in the name of curing her of her coldness. Later, long after the storm had passed and the house was filled with a deep, quiet stillness, Eleanor rose to get a drink of water. The fire in the main room had burned down to glowing embers. Caleb was not in his room. She found him slumped in the large armchair, fast asleep. He must have been exhausted. An empty cup sat on the floor beside him. The soft, flickering light played on his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw. He looked younger, more vulnerable. As she watched, he stirred, his brow furrowed. He murmured a name in his sleep, a single, broken word. Jacob. It was a sound of such profound, unguarded loss that it stopped her breath. In that moment, he was not the stoic rancher, her quiet, perplexing husband. He was just a man grieving his brother. All the hardness in her, all the fear, seemed to recede, replaced by a sudden, aching wave of empathy. He had his own deep wounds, his own ghosts that haunted him in the dark. Moving quietly, she picked up his mother's blue shawl from the back of the chair where it always lay. She hesitated for only a second before gently draping it over his sleeping form, tucking it around his shoulders. For the first time since she had arrived in Promise, her expression was not one of cold indifference or guarded fear. As she looked down at the sleeping man, her face was soft. A few days later, she was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of soup for their supper. A loose strand of hair had escaped her bun and was tickling her cheek. She was about to brush it away when Caleb came up beside her to get a cup of water from the bucket. He paused, and with a movement so natural and unthinking it was over before she could react. He reached out and gently brushed the stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers just grazing her temple. Her entire body went rigid. Her breath hitched. She froze, the wooden spoon held tight in her hand. Her eyes locked on his. She was bracing for the next move, for the hand to tighten, for the voice to turn cruel. But it never came. He simply looked at her, his hand dropping back to his side, his expression unreadable. He had touched her, a small, intimate, gentle gesture. And she had not pulled away. She had not flinched. She had simply stared, her heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. That night, the silence in the house felt different again. It was not empty, not tense, but charged with a fragile, unspoken awareness. As she prepared to go to her room, she stopped in the doorway, her back to him. She did not turn around. She couldn't bear to see his face. "I know you're not him," she said, her voice barely a whisper, thin and trembling in the quiet room. "But I don't know how to stop bracing for fists." The season was turning, the crisp autumn air holding a new, sharper edge. The cottonwoods along the creek bed had turned a brilliant, aching yellow, a last flare of color before the long, gray sleep of winter. It was this change, this sense of communal gathering before the cold, that prompted Caleb to speak one evening as they finished their quiet supper. "There's a harvest dance in town Saturday next," he said, his voice casual, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee cup. "The whole county will be there. Fiddles, food, a break from the work." He paused, then finally looked at her. "I thought we might go." The suggestion fell into the quiet room like a stone into a still pond, the ripples spreading out instantly. Eleanor's hands, which had been resting on the table, drew back into her lap, her spine straightened, every muscle in her body tensing. A dance. The words themselves were a threat. A room full of people, noise, laughter, the press of bodies, the casual, well-meaning touches of strangers, the assessing eyes of the women, the curious glances of the men. It was a vision of her own personal hell. "No," she said. The word was small, but absolute. A shard of ice. Caleb did not seem surprised. He didn't argue. He simply held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said, and a flicker of something she couldn't name, disappointment, perhaps, or resignation, passed through his eyes before he looked away. He drank his coffee, and the subject was not raised again. But the idea of it, the image of it, had been planted in her mind, and it festered. On Saturday, the day of the dance, the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. She knew Caleb was staying home on her account. She could feel his quiet, restless energy as he busied himself with chores he had already completed, mending a piece of tack that was not broken, sharpening an axe that was already keen. He was a man who enjoyed the company of his neighbors. She realized he had given up a rare night of fellowship to sit in a silent house with his silent wife. The thought did not make her feel guilty. It made her feel like a cage. That afternoon, while he was out checking a far fence line, she found herself tidying his parents' room, the room that was now hers, in the back of the large wardrobe, tucked away beneath a stack of spare linens. Her hand brushed against something hard and flat. It was a mirror, its silvered surface clouded with disuse. Beside it was a large, cedar-lined chest. She had never opened it, feeling it was a violation of a past that was not hers. But today, a strange compulsion took hold of her. She lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and thyme rose up to meet her. Inside, carefully folded and preserved, were a woman's clothes, Caleb's mother's clothes. They were simple, practical dresses for the most part. But one was different. It was made of a soft, deep green wool, the color of a pine forest at dusk. It was a dress meant for an occasion, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It was the dress of a woman who was loved, a woman who went to dances. On an impulse she could not explain, she took the dress and the mirror. She propped the mirror against the wall, its surface a murky portal. After a moment's hesitation, she unbuttoned her own drab gray dress and let it fall to the floor. She stood in her chemise, a thin, pale ghost in the dim light. Then, with trembling fingers, she lifted the green dress and pulled it over her head. The wool was soft against her skin. It fit surprisingly well. She turned to the mirror and stared at the stranger who looked back at her. The woman in the glass had her face, her dark hair, her pale skin, but the dress changed her. It gave her a softness, a hint of color that made her eyes seem less like chips of stone and more like the shadowed gray of a stormy sea. For a fleeting second, she saw not the ruined thing she knew herself to be, but a woman, just a woman. And then the tears came. They were not the violent, shuddering sobs she sometimes choked back in the dead of night. They were silent, hot tears that welled up and spilled over, tracing paths down her cheeks. She cried for the girl she had been, the one who might have worn such a dress with a light heart. She cried for the woman in the mirror who was a lie. She cried for the unbearable, impossible distance between this soft green wool and her own hard, broken reality. She did not make a sound, her hand pressed tight against her mouth, until the storm of grief had passed, leaving her hollow and cold. The confrontation came 2 days later. She was in the vegetable garden, pulling the last of the tough-skinned squash, when she saw a figure marching up the path from the neighboring ranch. It was Martha Larson, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched in a look of sour disapproval. Her husband, John, was a hard-working but simple-minded man who sometimes traded labor with Caleb. Martha stopped at the edge of the garden, her hands on her hips, her chest heaving as if she had run the entire way. "You!" she said, her voice sharp and accusing. Eleanor stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. "Mrs. Larson?" "Do not you Mrs. Larson me, you homewrecker." The word was ugly, spat out like a curse. "I saw him. I saw my John, leaving here yesterday at sunrise. He wasn't mending any fence. I know what he was doing, and I know what you are." Eleanor stared at her, bewildered. "Your husband was helping Caleb with a downed tree on the north pasture. They worked until after dark. Caleb offered him a bed in the barn rather than have him ride home in the pitch black." "A bed in the barn?" Martha let out a high, derisive laugh. "Is that what you call it? I see the way you look at men, all quiet and wounded, like a little bird with a broken wing. You think they don't see it for what it is? An invitation. You think my John is immune to a pretty, cold thing like you. acting all helpless. The accusation was so monstrous, so far from the carefully constructed emptiness of her life, that Eleanor could not even form a defense. The woman was seeing a predator where there was only prey. "You are mistaken," Eleanor said, her voice low and shaking. "Am I?" Martha took a step closer, her eyes blazing with a righteous, jealous fury. "Stay away from my husband. You are a sickness in this valley, a woman with no past and no shame." She lunged forward and grabbed Eleanor's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "Do you hear me?" The touch was lightning. The grip, the angry face, the hateful words. It was all a sudden, violent echo of her past. A guttural sound of pure panic escaped Eleanor's throat. She wrenched her arm back, shoving Martha away with a strength born of sheer terror. Martha stumbled backward, tripping over a vine and landing hard in the dirt, her face a mask of shocked indignation. Eleanor didn't wait to see more. She turned and ran. She did not run toward the house, toward the flimsy safety of its walls. She ran away, past the barn, past the corral, and into the sparse woods that bordered the ranch. She ran blindly, branches whipping at her face and clothes, her lungs burning, the sobs she had held back for years finally tearing their way out of her. She ran until she could run no more and collapsed in a small, sun-dappled clearing, sheltered by a ring of hardy junipers. And there, she finally broke. The silent, graceful tears of the other day were gone, replaced by raw, ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She curled into a ball on the bed of dry pine needles, her face pressed into the dirt, and wept for everything. For the shame, for the fear, for the injustice of being a prisoner in a life she had not chosen. Haunted by a man who was dead and judged by people who were alive. She did not know how long she lay there, lost in a storm of her own making. She did not hear him approach. She only knew that suddenly, the sunlight was partially blocked by a large shape. She flinched, scrambling backward, her heart seizing with a fresh wave of terror. But it was only Caleb. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face etched with a deep, aching concern. He had seen the end of the confrontation with Martha, had seen her flee. He did not speak. He did not rush toward her. He simply watched her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her tear-streaked face, her disheveled hair, her trembling form. Then, very slowly, he walked into the clearing and sat down on the grass a few feet away from her. He did not touch her. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just sat, his back against a juniper tree, and shared the silence with her, his presence a quiet, steady anchor in her swirling sea of pain. His stillness was a profound gift. It asked nothing of her. It did not demand an explanation or a recovery. It simply allowed her to be broken, gradually. Her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. The wild panic receded, leaving behind a vast, desolate emptiness. They sat that way for a long time. The only sounds the whisper of the wind in the trees and the distant call of a hawk. Finally, it was she who broke the silence. Her voice was a raw, ragged whisper. "She thinks I am a temptress." She gave a short, broken laugh that was more painful than a sob. "She thinks I am a danger to her husband." Caleb's voice, when he spoke, was low and gentle. "Martha Larson sees threats where there are none. It is her own fear speaking." "She is not the first," Eleanor whispered, her gaze fixed on her own tightly clenched hands. My husband, Daniel." He thought so, too. He thought any man who looked at me was my fault. He thought my silence was an accusation. My sadness was a manipulation. The words began to come then, hesitant at first, then flowing in a raw, unfiltered torrent, as if a dam inside her had finally burst. She told him everything. She told him of the marriage she had been forced into, of Daniel's charm that curdled into control, of his drinking, of his fists. She told him of the constant, soul-crushing fear, of walking on eggshells, of learning to make herself small and quiet and invisible. "I was with child," Once, she said, her voice dropping so low it was almost lost in the wind. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, a phantom gesture of protection. I was so careful. I did everything he said, but one night he was angry. About nothing, about the soup being too cold. He pushed me. I fell. She stopped, her throat closing around the memory. There was so much blood. I lost the baby. He blamed me. He said I had done it on purpose, to spite him. Caleb's face was a study in anguish. He had not moved, but his hands were clenched into fists on his knees, his knuckles white. She took a shuddering breath and forced herself to finish. She told him about the final night, the poker, the blood, the awful, deafening silence of his death. She told him what the lawman had said. He told me to run. He said I was lucky he was dead. She looked up then, her eyes meeting Caleb's for the first time. They were raw, stripped of all their icy defenses. Was I lucky, Caleb, to be left with this? To be so broken that a kind word feels like a threat? To be so terrified of a man's touch that I would rather die than be held? Caleb's own eyes were wet with unshed tears. He did not offer pity. He did not offer judgment. He just looked at her, his gaze filled with a profound, heartbreaking empathy. He finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. You don't need to be anything for me, Eleanor, he said, his voice cracking on her name. Not a wife, not a housekeeper, not anything. Just live. That's all. That night, after a supper eaten in a silence that was now filled with a fragile, aching tenderness, Eleanor went to her room. She poured water from the pitcher into the basin to wash. As she unbuttoned her dress, she caught a glimpse of her own arm in the cloudy mirror. A dark, ugly bruise was forming where Martha Larson had grabbed her. She undressed slowly, her eyes tracing the landscape of her own body. There were other marks, faint, silvery scars on her ribs, a small, puckered circle on her shoulder. They were the ghosts of old injuries, a map of Daniel's rage. For years, she had looked at them with shame and disgust. But tonight, in the wake of her confession, she saw them differently. They were not marks of shame. They were marks of survival. She had endured. She was still here. For the first time in her life, she touched one of the old scars with a kind of gentle reverence. She was not disgusting. She was a survivor. The door to her room creaked open. Caleb stood there, his hand on the knob, an apology already forming on his lips. Eleanor, I just wanted to see if you needed... He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Eleanor standing in her thin chemise, her bruises, old and new, visible in the soft lamplight. She flinched, her arms flying up to cover herself, a purely instinctual reaction. But Caleb's reaction was just as swift. He turned away immediately, his face averted, his whole body radiating a deep, respectful shame for his intrusion. I am so sorry, he said, his voice low and mortified, his eyes fixed on the doorframe. Forgive me, I did not mean to... He backed away, pulling the door quietly shut behind him. She stood there, her heart pounding. His reaction had been so different from what she would have expected. There was no lingering gaze, no flicker of desire or opportunity. There was only apology, respect, safety. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, her brokenness laid bare, and his first and only instinct had been to protect her dignity. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the fear in her own eyes, and then she looked at the closed door behind which stood the man who had listened to her story without flinching and had honored her pain with his quiet presence. She took a breath, a deep, shaky thing that seemed to come from the very bottom of her soul. A terrifying, fragile seed of hope was taking root in the barren soil of her heart. She called out, her voice quiet but clear in the still house, a question that held the entire weight of her past and the terrifying possibility of a future. Do you still want a bride with eyes like mine? The question Eleanor had asked hung in the air between them for 3 days. a fragile bridge built over a chasm of fear. Caleb had not answered it with words. He had answered it with a quiet, unwavering steadiness. He met her eyes more often now, not with a demanding gaze, but with a look of simple, shared existence. The space between them, once a frozen tundra, had begun to thaw into a tentative spring. They were not husband and wife, not yet. They were two solitary people who had decided to stand together against the cold. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a half-dozen strangers in promise. They were not ranchers or prospectors. They had the hard, restless look of men who followed the promise of $1. No matter how it was earned, they rode into town on tired horses, their clothes coated in the dust of a long journey, and made their way directly to the saloon. Caleb and Eleanor were in the general store, picking up a sack of flour, when the men swaggered out of the saloon, blinking in the harsh afternoon light. One of them, a man with a greasy smile and eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they saw, stopped dead. His gaze fell on Eleanor, and his smile widened into a smirk of ugly recognition. Eleanor felt his stare like a physical touch, a cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She knew him. His name was Finn, and he had been one of Daniel's drinking companions, a man who had looked at her with the same possessive contempt as her husband. She turned her head, hoping the brim of her bonnet would shield her, praying he would move on. But he didn't. He nudged one of his companions and pointed with his chin. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the dusty street. "Look what the wind blew in. Sarah Mayhew, ain't it? Or is it Mrs. Vance now? Hard to keep track." The use of her real name, a name she had tried to bury, was a violation. It stripped her of the fragile identity she had built. Caleb, who had been paying Mr. Gable, turned slowly. He looked at Finn, then at the rigid terror in Eleanor's posture. He placed the coins on the counter and walked out of the store to stand beside her, a silent, solid presence. Finn swaggered toward them, his friends trailing behind him like vultures. "Didn't figure on seeing you again, Sarah," he said, ignoring Caleb completely. "Especially not out here in God's nowhere. Last I heard, you'd vanished after poor Daniel's accident." He loaded the last word with a heavy, knowing insinuation. "My wife's name is Eleanor Armstrong," Caleb said, his voice calm and level, but with an underlying current of steel. "You've mistaken her for someone else." Finn laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, I don't make mistakes about a face like that. I knew her when she belonged to Daniel Mayhew. A cold piece of work, that one. Always acting too good for the rest of us." He looked Eleanor up and down, his eyes lingering in a way that made her feel naked and soiled. "Looks like you found yourself another man to take care of you. He know what happened to the last one?" "That's enough," Caleb said, taking a step forward, subtly positioning himself between Finn and Eleanor. "Is it?" Finn's eyes gleamed with malice. He was enjoying this, enjoying the power he held. "I think the folks in this town might be interested to hear about the kind of woman you've brought amongst them. Maybe you should ask her. Ask her what happened to her last husband. Ask her why she ran." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Ask her how it feels to kill a man. It happened faster than anyone could react." Caleb's quiet stillness exploded into motion. He didn't say another word. His right arm shot out, and his fist connected with Finn's jaw with a sickening crack. Finn staggered backward, his head snapping to the side, and crumpled into the dust, out cold. A shocked silence fell over the street. The other drifters stared, momentarily stunned. The townsfolk who had gathered to watch looked on in disbelief. Caleb Armstrong, the quietest, most peaceable man in the county, had just laid a man out flat with a single punch. Caleb stood over Finn's unconscious form, his chest heaving, his hand already swelling. He looked not at the man on the ground, but at Eleanor. his eyes blazing with a protective fury that was more potent than any words of affection he could have ever spoken. The town's sheriff, a weary, middle-aged man named Elias Thorne, pushed his way through the crowd. "All right, Caleb, what's all this?" "This man was threatening my wife," Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled rage. One of Finn's companions, emboldened now that the initial shock had worn off, stepped forward. "He's a liar. That woman is a murderess. She killed her husband back in Carson County, and we can prove it." Sheriff Thorne looked from the angry drifter to Caleb's stony face, and then to Eleanor, who stood frozen, her face as white as bleached bone. "Is that so?" he said, his voice heavy. He sighed, the sound of a man who knew his afternoon had just been ruined. "Well, I suppose we'd better sort this out down at my office. All of you." The sheriff's office was a small, cramped room that smelled of stale coffee and sawdust. Eleanor sat on a hard wooden chair, Caleb standing protectively beside her. Finn was there, holding a bloody rag to his jaw, his eyes full of hatred. His friends stood along the back wall, a chorus of silent accusers. The air was thick with the weight of officialdom and male judgment. "Now," Sheriff Thorne began, seating himself behind his desk, "this man here says your wife, Mrs. Armstrong, or Mrs. Mayhew, is wanted for murder." He looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to hear your side of this." It was the moment she had been running from, the public reckoning she had known. In some dark corner of her soul, would one day come. Her throat was dry. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles ached. She felt Caleb's presence beside her, a warm, solid anchor in the terrifying storm. She took a breath and, looking at the scarred surface of the sheriff's desk, she began to speak. She told the story in a low, flat monotone, her voice devoid of emotion. It was the only way she could get the words out without shattering. She spoke of Daniel's cruelty, of the years of fear, of the final, bloody night. She did not cry. She did not plead for sympathy. She simply presented the facts, a stark and brutal accounting of her life. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Finn sneered. "A likely story. She killed him in cold blood. Sheriff, she was always a cold one." Sheriff Thorne ignored him. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze thoughtful. "Carson County," he mused. "I know the lawman over there. Man named Bill Pullman." He stood up and went to the telegraph key in the corner of the room. "We'll see what he has to say." The wait was an eternity. Eleanor felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, even though there were only a handful of people in the room. She stared at the floor, focusing on a crack in the floorboards, making it the entire world. Caleb never moved from her side. He did not touch her, but she could feel his strength, a silent promise of support. Finally, the telegraph began to chatter. The sheriff scribbled on a piece of paper, his expression unreadable. When it was finished, he came back to his desk and read the message. His brow furrowed. He looked up, first at Finn, then at Eleanor. "Well," he said slowly, "according to Sheriff Pullman, the matter of Daniel Mayhew's death was investigated thoroughly. The coroner's jury ruled it a case of self-defense. The charges against Sarah Mayhew were dropped over 2 years ago. As far as the law is concerned, she is a free woman." A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over Eleanor. Finn and his friends began to protest, but the sheriff silenced them with a sharp look. "But," he continued, and the word landed like a stone in Eleanor's stomach, "he also says a man is dead, and gossip has a longer life than truth. He advises that the lady has powerful in-laws who never did accept the ruling." He folded the paper. "Now, as for you," he said, pointing at Finn, "Caleb was within his rights to defend his wife from your slander. But I don't like brawling in my town. You and your friends have an hour to be on your way. Do not let the sun set on you in my jurisdiction." Finn glared at Caleb, then at Eleanor, a look of pure venom in his eyes. He and his friends left without another word. But the damage was done. The truth had been spoken. But it was a truth stained with blood and suspicion. In the days that followed, a frost descended upon their lives. The law may have cleared her, but the court of public opinion and promise had found her guilty. When they went to the general store, conversations would cease. Heads would turn away. Mr. Gable was suddenly too busy to fill their order right away, asking them to come back in an hour. Women who had once offered a polite nod now crossed the street to avoid them, sometimes pulling their children closer as if Eleanor were a contagion. The frost touched Caleb's business, too. A deal he had been negotiating with a cattle buyer from out of state suddenly fell through, the man offering a flimsy excuse about market prices. Neighbors who had once been friendly now rode past their ranch without a wave. They were isolated, shunned, an island in a sea of suspicion. Eleanor watched it all, a cold, heavy weight settling in her chest. She had brought this down on him. Her past, the ugly, violent secret she had carried, was now destroying the life of the one man who had shown her decency. The respect he had worked so hard to build in this community was crumbling to dust because of her. She could not bear it. One evening, as he sat by the fire, mending a bridle with slow, deliberate movements, she stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You should let me go, Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not be the reason your life is ruined. I can pack my things and be gone by morning. You can tell them I ran off. They will believe it. Your reputation will mend." He did not look up from his work. He continued to thread the leather thong through the hole, his hands steady. "And where would you go?" he asked, his voice low. "It does not matter. I will find somewhere." "And run again?" he asked, finally looking up at her. His eyes were clear and direct, holding no trace of anger or blame. "And keep running every time your past catches up to you. Is that the life you want?" "It is the life I have," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. "It is the life I bring to others. Look what I have brought to you. Your friends avoid you. Your business is suffering. I am a curse. Caleb." He put down the bridle and stood up, until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I made a bargain," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "I asked for a wife. I gave you my name. I knew you had secrets. Everyone does. I did not ask for a wife with an easy past. I asked for you." He reached out, not to touch her face or her hair, but to gently take one of her clenched hands in his. He unfurled her rigid fingers, his thumb stroking softly over her cold skin. "You're my wife, cold eyes and all," he said, his voice a low, fierce vow. "I'll weather their frost before I lose you." His words, his touch, his absolute, unconditional loyalty. It was the one thing she had no defense against, the fortress of ice she had lived in for so long, the fortress that had withstood fists and hatred and fear, finally crumbled under the weight of his kindness. A single, ragged sob escaped her, and then another. Her strength gave out, and she began to weep. Not the silent, controlled tears of her solitude, but the deep, racking sobs of a soul that had been broken for far too long. He pulled her to him then, wrapping his arms around her as her body shook with the force of her grief. She buried her face in his chest, her hands clutching his shirt. It was not a lover's embrace, not an act of passion. It was the hold of a man anchoring a ship in a storm. He said nothing. He just held her, stroking her hair, letting her cry, absorbing her pain into the solid, steady strength of his own body until the storm had passed and she was left limp and exhausted against him. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the memory of his arms around her, a phantom warmth on her skin. He had not broken her. He had held her while she broke, and he had not let go. Finally, she rose, barefoot, clad only in her thin white nightgown. She walked out of her room and across the cold floorboards to his doorway. He was not asleep. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, as if he had been waiting. He looked up as she appeared, a question in his eyes. She said nothing. There were no words for what she felt, for the terrifying, fragile trust that was blooming in the wasteland of her heart. She just stood there, her breath a soft, shaky sound in the stillness, and waited. He stood up slowly and came to her. He led her gently by the hand into his room, to the side of his bed. The only light was the pale moonlight filtering through the small window. He did not kiss her. He did not speak. He simply stood before her and, with infinite slowness, he began to undress her. He started with the simple wool robe she wore. His fingers were clumsy on the buttons, but his movements were deliberate. He paused, his eyes locked on her face, searching for any flicker of fear. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and he slid the robe from her shoulders. He undressed her as if he were unwrapping a priceless, fragile gift. He untied the ribbon at the neck of her nightgown, his knuckles brushing her collarbone. He paused again, waiting. She nodded again. He pushed the soft cotton from her shoulders, letting it pool at her feet, until she stood before him in the moonlight, her scars and her bruises and her fears all laid bare. He looked at her, and his gaze held no hunger, only a profound and gentle reverence. He reached up, his hand calloused and warm, and cupped her cheek. And as he looked at her, something inside her finally let go. The ice in her eyes, the shield she had carried for a lifetime, did not melt. It seemed to dissolve, leaving behind a clear, deep gray, soft and vulnerable, and full of a light he had never seen before. Her eyes had turned soft, not from fear, but from a trust so complete it stole her breath. "You're not breaking me," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she would not shed. "You're letting me breathe." The world, which had been a thing of sharp edges and cold, hard surfaces, began to soften. The days following Eleanor's confession were not marked by grand declarations or dramatic changes, but by 1,000 tiny shifts in the space between them. A quiet affection bloomed in the silences, which were no longer empty but filled with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. Their life took on a new rhythm, a shared cadence of partnership. They mended fences side by side, their movements synchronized, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same tool. In the evenings, she would read from one of his books while he cleaned and oiled his tack, the sound of her voice a soft counterpoint to the rhythmic pull of the cloth on leather. He started leaving a single wildflower, a stubborn piece of desert beauty, on the kitchen table for her each morning. She, in turn, began to bake bread, filling the small house with a warm, yeasty scent that spoke of permanence and life. The acts were small, but they were the foundations of a home being built where a shelter had once stood. One afternoon, a clumsy calf tripped over a water bucket, sending a spray of water all over Caleb, who stood there dripping and looking utterly bewildered. A sound bubbled up in Eleanor's throat, a sound so unfamiliar it startled her. It was a laugh, not a small, polite chuckle, but a genuine, full-throated laugh of pure amusement. Caleb stared at her, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his face. The sound of her laughter was more beautiful than any birdsong he had ever heard. It was the sound of a thaw, of life returning to a frozen landscape. This new life, this tentative reclaiming of herself, began to push outward from the sanctuary of the ranch. Their nearest neighbors, the Millers, were a young couple with a small daughter. When word came that Mrs. Miller was bedridden with a fever, Eleanor acted without a moment's thought. She spent the morning making a rich beef stew and a fresh loaf of bread. She walked the half-mile to their small homestead and knocked on the door. "Mr. Miller," his face drawn with worry, looked at her in surprise. "I heard your wife was unwell," Eleanor said simply, holding out the basket. "And a small child is a handful on its own." She did not offer pity or platitudes. It was a statement of practical compassion. The act forged a small, sturdy bridge across the divide of town gossip. Her newfound voice found its sharpest edge a week later, back in the place of her public humiliation, the general store. She and Caleb were waiting their turn when a young woman, Mary, the blacksmith's daughter, came in. The girl was barely 17, unmarried, and her pregnancy was just beginning to show beneath her shawl. A hush fell over the store. Mrs. Gable and two of her companions, who were standing by the pickle barrel, began to whisper, their voices loud enough to carry the word whore, a venomous hiss. Mary paled, her hand going to her stomach, her shoulders slumping in shame. She made to turn and leave, but Eleanor stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at the gossiping women. She looked directly at Mary, her expression one of calm, unshakable solidarity. "Mary," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I was just about to buy some of that peppermint candy. My husband tells me it is the best cure for an unsettled stomach. Perhaps you would allow me to buy you some." It was not just an act of kindness. It was a public alignment. It was one woman, once judged, standing with another, Mrs. Gable and her friends fell silent, their own petty cruelty exposed and shamed by a simple, decent gesture. Eleanor ignored them, continuing to speak quietly with Mary about the quality of Mr. Gable's molasses until the girl's color had returned. As they left the store, Caleb placed his hand on the small of her back, a silent, proud affirmation of the woman she was becoming. But the peace of the valley was fragile. A new threat was moving through the high country, a group of cattle thieves who were growing bolder by the week. They were not common rustlers. They were organized and ruthless. First, the Double Creek Ranch was hit, losing 50 head. Then, the Larsons' place was raided, their prized bull shot dead as a warning. The threat was no longer a distant rumor. It was a creeping shadow, moving steadily closer to their own land. Caleb grew quiet, a familiar tension settling in his shoulders. "We'll move the herd to the upper pasture," he said one evening, staring into the fire. "It's more sheltered, harder to get to. We'll lie low, wait for them to move on." Eleanor stopped her mending and looked at him. She heard the echo of a past strategy in his words. Hiding, waiting, making oneself small in the hope that danger would pass by. It was a strategy she knew intimately, and she knew it did not work. "And what if they do not move on, Caleb?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "What if they see a man hiding his herd and take it as a sign of weakness, as an invitation?" "It is better than inviting a fight we cannot win," he countered, his jaw tight. "Running does not work," she said, and her voice held the weight of her own history. "Hiding does not make the threat go away. It just waits. It follows you. We cannot live our lives in fear of what might come. We have to stand and face it." He turned to look at her, his face a mask of pain. "You do not understand what you are asking." "I am asking you to fight for our home," she said, her own resolve hardening. "And I am trying not to lose you," he burst out, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He stood up and paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. "I cannot lose you. Ellie." He stopped and faced her, his eyes full of a deep, old grief. "I lost my brother that way." He finally told her the whole story. Jacob, his younger, reckless brother, had been full of fire and pride. When rustlers had hit their ranch years ago, Jacob had refused to be cautious. He had called it cowardice. He was trying to be a hero. "Ellie," Caleb said, his voice breaking. He rode out alone in the middle of the night to face them, to prove how brave he was. I begged him not to go. He sank into his chair, his head in his hands. I found him the next morning. They had left him in the dust. I buried my own brother. I buried him because he thought a fight was more important than his life. I will not lose you the same way. His confession was a key, unlocking the last hidden room of his heart. She understood now that his caution was not weakness, but a wound that had never healed, instead of making her back down. However, his story solidified her purpose. She went to him and knelt by his chair, taking his hand. "You will not lose me," she said, her voice fierce with a certainty that came from a place beyond fear. "Because I will not be reckless like Jacob, and I will not be a victim like I was. There is another way. We do not have to be heroes. Caleb, we just have to be smart, and we have to stand together." The next morning, she rode out. She went first to the Millers, then to the Larsons, and then to the 2 other small ranches in their part of the valley. She did not ask the men to be heroes. She did not speak of bravery or honor. She spoke of strategy. "They are hitting us one by one because we are scattered and scared," she said, her voice calm and logical as the small group of ranchers gathered in Caleb's barn, the very place she once had flashbacks of terror. "But my husband's ranch is the most defensible. We have the creek at our back and a clear view of the valley approach. If we gather all our families here, and all our able-bodied men, we can present a united front. They are looking for easy targets. We will not be easy." She laid out a plan for watches, for signals, for how to protect the women and children. The men, who had been grim and defeated, listened. They saw not a frightened woman, but a clear-headed leader. Caleb stood at her side, a mixture of terror and profound awe on his face. He was seeing a side of his wife he had never imagined, a core of tempered steel that had been forged in a fire he was only now beginning to understand. The neighbors agreed. It was their only chance. They came that night. A moonless, starless dark had fallen over the valley. The women and children, including the miller's small daughter, were hidden in the root cellar beneath the house. The men were positioned behind the corral fences and the wagon, rifles ready. Eleanor had insisted on taking a post at the main house window, a rifle of her own resting on the sill. The first sign of their approach was the nervous lowing of the cattle. Then, dark shapes on horseback, moving silently at the edge of the pasture. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She watched as one of the riders dismounted, a torch in his hand, and began creeping toward the barn. He meant to set a fire, to create chaos. She took a deep breath, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar shattered the night. She had not aimed at the man, but at the ground a few feet in front of him. The rustler yelped, dropping the torch, and scrambled back to his horse. The night erupted in a volley of gunfire. The fight was a chaotic blur of muzzle flashes, shouting, and the terrified cries of the livestock. Caleb and the others were holding them back, a stubborn wall of defiance. During a brief lull in the shooting, the root cellar door creaked open. The miller's little girl, terrified by the noise, had slipped out and was running in a blind panic across the open yard. A shot rang out from the darkness, a stray bullet whining through the air. Eleanor saw it all in a horrifying instant. The child, the path of the bullet. She did not think. She moved. She launched herself from the doorway, covering the distance in 3 long strides and throwing herself at the child, shoving her hard to the ground. A searing, white-hot pain tore through her shoulder. She cried out, a sharp gasp, as she fell, her body covering the small girl. "Eleanor!" Caleb's voice was a raw, terrified scream. He abandoned his post, running from the cover of the wagon, his own safety forgotten. He reached her side, his face a pale mask of terror in the flickering light. He saw the blood blooming on her dress, the torn fabric at her shoulder. His composure, his famous quiet strength, shattered into a million pieces. "No, Ellie," he choked out, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her. "Don't you die. Please, don't you leave me." The fighting was already receding. The thieves, realizing they had stumbled into an organized defense, were retreating into the darkness. But Caleb did not notice. His entire world had narrowed to his wife, bleeding in the dirt. She looked up at him, her face pale with pain. But her eyes, those eyes that had once been so cold, were clear and blazing with a fierce, unwavering light. She reached up with her good hand and touched his cheek, her fingers leaving a bloody smear on his skin. "You gave me something to fight for," she whispered. After the neighbors had confirmed the rustlers were gone, they carried her inside. The bullet had torn through the flesh of her shoulder, a painful, bleeding gash. But it had missed the bone. It was not a mortal wound. As Martha Larson, her face grim with a newfound respect, tended to the injury, Caleb slumped into a chair by the fire. The tension, the fear, the near unbearable thought of losing her finally broke through his stoic control. He put his face in his hands, and his broad shoulders began to shake. He wept, not the quiet tears of a man in grief, but with great, ragged, shuddering sobs of a man who had been to the brink of an unbearable loss and been pulled back. Eleanor, her arm bandaged and held in a sling, went to him, wincing with the pain. She knelt beside his chair. She wrapped her good arm around him and cradled his head against her, her hand stroking his hair. She was the injured one. But in that moment, she was the anchor. She was strong and quiet, comforting the man who had taught her what strength truly was, the man she loved. The story of the raid at Armstrong's ranch traveled through the valley faster than a prairie fire. But the version that took root was not just about a band of thieves being driven off. It was about the woman who had planned the defense, the woman who had fired the first shot, the woman who had taken a bullet to save a child, the label they had pinned on her. The cold bride, flaked away like old paint, revealing the substance underneath. She was no longer a mystery to be whispered about. She was a woman of grit, a woman of heart. The change was most apparent in the small, everyday interactions that formed the fabric of community life. When Eleanor walked into the general store now, her arm still in a sling, the whispers that followed her were not of suspicion, but of awe. Martha Larson, the same woman who had accused her of being a sickness, met her by the flour barrels and pressed a small jar of her best apple butter into Eleanor's good hand. "For your shoulder," she'd mumbled, her eyes cast down in a gesture of rough apology. "You did a brave thing for that little girl." It was not a friendship, but it was a truce, a hard-won respect that meant more than any easy affection. The town began to see Caleb differently, too. They saw not a fool who had been saddled with a mysterious, damaged woman, but a man of quiet wisdom who had seen the strength in her when no one else had. The cattle buyer who had backed out of their deal returned, hat in hand, his excuses flimsy but his offer now firm. The neighbors who had once avoided their lane now stopped by to ask Caleb's advice on the weather or a sick calf, their gazes lingering on Eleanor with a new, profound respect. They had become, in the truest sense, the Armstrongs of Promise Valley. As Eleanor's shoulder healed, so did the last, deepest parts of her soul. The constant, low-level fear that had been her companion for years finally receded, leaving behind a quiet calm she had never known. She moved with a new ease, the stiff, guarded posture replaced by a relaxed grace. The house was filled not just with the scent of her baking, but with the sound of her humming, small, absent-minded tunes that spoke of a contented heart. One evening in late spring, as the setting sun painted the sky in the shades of rose and violet, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the first stars appear. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new grass. Caleb had been quiet for a long time, turning a small, smooth river stone over and over in his hand. He finally set the stone down and turned to her. His face was serious, his hazel eyes full of a deep, gentle light. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low and steady. "When I first wrote to you, I made a bargain. It was a business arrangement. I offered you my name and my protection in exchange for a wife to quiet the town's gossip." She looked at him, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. She knew this was not about the past. It was not an honest bargain. He continued, his gaze unwavering. "Because I did not know what I was asking for. I did not know I was asking for the strongest, bravest, kindest woman I have ever known. I did not know I would come to. I did not know that my life would feel empty and colorless without you in it." He reached out and took her hand, the one that was not scarred, and held it gently in his own calloused ones. "That first contract is null and void. I am proposing a new one." He took a deep breath. "Eleanor Vance, will you marry me? Not to be a shield, not to satisfy expectations, not because of any bargain, but because I love you, because I cannot imagine a single day of my life without you by my side. There are no other terms, there are no expectations, only my whole heart, for the rest of my days, if you will have it." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the earnest, hopeful face of the man before her. He was offering her not a contract, but a covenant. He was offering her the one thing she had never believed she could have, a love that was a gift, not a cage. She did not need flowers or fanfare. She did not need a ring. She answered him without a single word. She simply leaned in and covered his hand with her own, her eyes meeting his in a look of such profound love and relief that it took his breath away. The look did not say yes. It said, "I'm finally home." They did not build a bigger house or a larger barn. The first thing they built together, with the help of the Millers and even John Larson, was a school. It was a small, one-room structure, built of sturdy timber on a corner of their land overlooking the creek. It was not for the town. It was for the valley, for the handful of children on the scattered ranches who had no hope of a formal education. But it was more than that. It was Eleanor's promise to the future. She taught the children their letters and their numbers, but she taught the girls something more. She taught them to read with a critical eye, to ask questions, to speak their thoughts clearly and without apology. She taught them that their voices mattered. In the faces of these bright, eager girls, she was healing a part of herself, giving them the tools she had never had, building a future where no woman would ever have to be as silent and as scared as she had once been. One day, a year or so later, a lone rider approached the ranch. He was an older man, his face weathered by sun and time, his shoulders slumped with a permanent weariness. He rode a tired-looking gray horse and wore the badge of a lawman, though it was tarnished with age. As he dismounted, Eleanor recognized him. It was Bill Pullman, the sheriff from Carson County, the man who had told her to run. Caleb stood beside her on the porch as the man approached, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. The sheriff removed his hat, his eyes finding Eleanor's. They were filled with a deep, ancient regret. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy, "I was passing through on my way to visit my sister's family. I heard a story in town about a Mrs. Armstrong. I had to see for myself if it was you." "It is," Eleanor said, her voice calm and even. The man twisted the brim of his hat in his hands. "I'm retiring next month. A man gets to thinking, at the end of his career, about the things he did right and the things he got wrong." He looked up at her, his gaze direct and full of shame. "I got it wrong with you, ma'am. I should have done more. I should have put Daniel Mayhew in a cell long before that night. I saw the bruises. I heard the whispers. I did nothing. I told you that you were lucky he was dead, and that was a cold, hard thing to say to a woman who had been through what you had been through. I failed you, and for that, I am truly, deeply sorry." Eleanor listened to his confession, the words of a man finally reckoning with his own conscience. The younger version of herself would have felt a surge of bitterness, of rage at this belated apology. But the woman who stood on the porch of her own home, a home filled with love and purpose, felt only a quiet, sad peace. "I forgive you, Sheriff," she said, and the words were a release, for him and for her. You were a man doing a job in a world that did not know how to protect women like me." She paused, then added, her voice clear and strong, filled with the unshakable truth she had earned. "But I saved myself. Do not ever forget that." The sheriff nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He had come to offer absolution to a victim and had found a survivor who needed nothing from him. On the first anniversary of their true wedding day, Caleb came back from the fields as dusk was settling. The house was quiet. He found her not by the hearth, not on the porch, but in the barn. She was standing in the very spot where she had once cowered during a storm, the place that had been a gateway to her most terrifying memories. The air was sweet with the smell of hay and old wood. A soft golden light from a lantern cast long shadows on the walls. She was not trembling. She was not lost in a flashback. She was smiling, a soft, serene expression on her face. She turned as she heard his footsteps. "I used to hate this place," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It felt like a tomb. It held all the ghosts." He came to stand before her, taking her hands in his. "And now?" he asked softly. She smiled and pulled him close, her head resting against his chest. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "This place doesn't scare me anymore," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Not with you beside me." Later that night, they lay together on a thick blanket in the pasture. The vast, velvet black sky, a canopy of glittering diamonds above them. The world was utterly still, the only sound the soft sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. It was a perfect, peaceful silence. Caleb propped himself up on one elbow and looked down at her. Her hair was a dark halo on the blanket, her face luminous in the starlight. He reached out and gently ran his hand over her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, a gesture of such familiar, tender love it made her heart ache with a quiet joy. Her eyes, which he had first seen as chips of ice, as windows to a frozen soul, were now open and clear, filled with a warm, steady light that seemed to reflect the stars above. They were not the eyes of a woman who had been broken and remade. They were the eyes of a woman who had finally, truly, come home to herself. "You didn't melt me," she said, her voice a soft whisper in the vast stillness of the night. Her eyes held his, full of love and a wisdom earned through fire. "You waited until I thawed." Thank you for being a part of our story tonight. We would love to hear where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with fellow travelers. Do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.